The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is a literature short. These are short videos to revise each chapter of Jekyll and Hyde, and in this video we're going to look at chapter 4, the Carew murder case. This will be a short video where we look briefly at the events of the chapter and then comment on some of the language. So let's move over here to look at the events. This chapter takes place a year on from the close of chapter 3. We are immediately told that a crime had startled London. We're then told the details of the crime, where a maid is described as having looked out the window to see an older man with white hair, who, it later transpires, is Sir Danvers Carew. She then sees Mr. Hyde, who she recognises, coming in the opposite direction. The men stop and speak before Hyde beats the older man to death. The maid faints. She wakes later and calls the police, who attend the scene and find half of the stick which had been used to beat Carew to death. They also find a purse, a gold watch and an envelope addressed to Utterson. This leads the police to talk to Utterson. Utterson goes to the police station to identify the body of Carew. He also recognises the stick as belonging to Henry Jekyll. Utterson takes the police to Hyde's house and his housekeeper comes to the door. Hyde is not in and the house appears to have been ransacked. I'll just put a note here in case you're unsure. This means torn apart, usually because someone's looting or stealing. They find the other half of the stick and a chequebook among ashes. They visit the bank to find that the murderer is several £1,000s in credit, and remember this would have been a vast sum of money in the 19th century. They decide to wait for him at the bank and hand out leaflets about him, but this proves an impossible task, as nobody can really pinpoint what he looks like. He can't be traced to any family. He'd never had his photograph taken, and those who can describe him give very different accounts. The chapter ends with a reminder of the haunting sense of unexpressed deformity. Let's look at some of the language in this chapter now. We'll start with the description of the setting and the fog. We're told that a fog rolled over the city in the small hours. The small hours are the very early hours in the morning after midnight. But that the early part of the night was cloudless and that the lane was lit brilliantly by the full moon. Of course, this means that the maid's account of the murder can be taken to be reliable insofar as she could see clearly, but Stevenson's novel is distinctly Gothic, and the imagery of the fog, which then clears for the full moon to light the way to illuminate a murder, brings about a distinctly creepy atmosphere, and it's here in this sinister atmosphere that we truly come to understand the reach of Hyde's malevolence. You might want to consider the implications of the full moon too in terms of folklore and mythology. The moon has piqued human interest since classical civilizations, and this would not have been lost on a 19th century reader. The reader would make associations with the supernatural and various superstitions. You might also want to consider the imagery of light and dark. The fog clears here and reflects the enlightenment of mankind as the Victorians continue to develop their understanding of science, religion and the nature of mankind. Later in the chapter there is another description of the fog as Utterson and the police make their way to Hyde's house. We are told that a chocolate-covered pool lowered over heaven, surely reflecting the confusion and lack of insight they have as to what is happening with Hyde. Stevenson then contrasts the fog with occasional moments of clarity, for as the wind blows the fog, a haggard shaft of daylight would glance in between the swirling wreaths. Not only do these glimmers of light reinforce the sinister atmosphere, but once more reflect the glimmers of understanding that were breaking through for Utterson, the reader, and perhaps developments of Victorians generally. Let's have a look now at the line where Stevenson describes Carew. We're told that he's an aged, beautiful gentleman with white hair, and that the moon shone on his face as he spoke, and that his face seemed to breathe such an innocent and old-world kindness of disposition. We can liken the description of Carew to that of a 19th century, and indeed earlier, depiction of a Christian god. We also have the maid, who reports that never had she felt more at peace with all men or thought more kindly of the world. Overall, this is a picture of innocence, tranquility and holiness, perhaps. What we need to draw our attention to, though, is the sharp contrast with Hyde, for when he is introduced to the scene, we hear of his ill-contained impatience. This irritation bubbling beneath the surface is clearly juxtaposed with the peace and contentment of the maid and the politeness of Carew. We also hear how he broke out in a great flame of anger. The imagery has progressed to show how the impatience that was lurking beneath has escalated into fiery anger. Of course, you'll have studied the phrase ape-like fury in depth, and there's plenty of analysis of that line available online and elsewhere, but it's helpful to look at the whole picture. We have clear and deep contrasts between good and evil. We can see the theme of duality reinforced here, and the sense of the supernatural in this scene too. We can see the clash between religion and science in the portrayal of Carew and the maid, and the destruction of it through the violence of Hyde, who is surely a symbol of scientific development and the embodiment of some of the concerns held over theories of evolution. Here we see the perception of crushing of traditional religious belief by science, and it's important that you understand that this was a perception. Some saw scientific developments as a threat to religion. This is not the same as saying that scientific developments were a threat to religion. Let's lastly have a look at the housekeeper, who had an evil face smoothed by hypocrisy, and Stevenson writes that a flash of odious joy appeared on her face at the thought that Hyde might be in trouble with the law. In his rather blunt description of an evil face, Stevenson makes it clear that this is not a good woman, but her hypocrisy reflects the theme of appearances that runs through the novel. The woman is a hypocrite. For a start, she's accepting wages from Hyde, but is joyous at the thought of his downfall. But the other characters in the setting consistently expose a facade of respectability when evil and corruption lie beneath. If we just return to this phrase, odious joy, odious is something repulsive or revolting, you'll recognise that as an oxymoron. But rather than just pointing out the language feature, you can do something better with this. You can consider how the veil of respectability, hiding a horror beneath, permeates every part of the novel, from the hidden depths of London to the complexities of the characters and their desperation to preserve their reputations, right down to the detail of the language. This oxymoron tells us about more than just her horrid delight. We'll leave it there. I'll return soon with Chapter 5. Until then, goodbye, and thanks for watching.